In the dim corridors of history, there exist files written in ink so dark and stamped with seals so final that entire generations were never meant to glimpse their contents. They are not the stories that filled post-war textbooks, nor the speeches delivered in victory parades. These are the fragments of history kept under lock and key, buried in archives, hidden in diplomatic vaults, and redacted into silence by governments on both sides of the Iron Curtain. From the forests of Smolensk to the sterile chambers of secret laboratories in Manchuria, from Allied bombers in the skies over Dresden to the covert operations of intelligence agencies desperate for advantage, the war's truest shadows never ended with 1945. They lived on in the ink of secret memoranda, in the missing pages of trial transcripts, in the whispered testimonies of survivors who were dismissed or erased. What you are about to hear are 4 files, 4 chilling records of atrocity, deception, and deliberate silence. Each is a scar upon the century, resurfacing from classified collections that once bore the stamp top secret. They are revelations not intended for public ears, records meant to be sealed for 100 years. Yet they surface now, like the smell of smoke that lingers long after the fire is gone, or the faint sound of boots in the forest where no soldiers remain. These are the hidden truths of the Second World War, truths governments tried to erase, but which refused to stay buried in the dust of forgotten archives. Chapter 1. Shadows Beneath Katyn Forest. The story begins in the bleak spring of 1940, when the frozen soil of Western Russia concealed a crime, written not in propaganda, but in the final directives of Joseph Stalin's secret police. The forest near Smolensk, known as Katyn, became the site of one of the war's most carefully orchestrated massacres. Declassified decades later, File 437K of the Soviet NKVD reveals the chilling precision of what unfolded. Polish officers, captured during the Soviet invasion of eastern Poland in September 1939, were not merely prisoners of war. They were judges, professors, priests, and the intellectual backbone of the Polish nation. In a memorandum dated March 5, 1940, signed by Lavrenti Beria and approved by Stalin, the order was clear. More than 22,000 men were to be executed as enemies of the Soviet state. The operation was carried out in waves, beginning in April. Prisoners from Kozelsk, Starobelsk, and Ostashkov camps were transported in sealed trucks to execution sites. NKVD officers, trained for silence and efficiency, carried German-made Walther pistols, chosen specifically for their reliability and concealment of Soviet fingerprints. Prisoners were told they were being transferred, but instead they were lined against pits in the Katyn woods, their hands bound, and shot once in the back of the head. Each death was logged, each name struck from a list typed on NKVD letterhead. Trucks ran day and night, delivering human cargo to be swallowed by the forest floor. The mass graves grew deeper, filled with the uniforms of Poland's officer corps and the books and rosaries they carried with them. The cover-up began immediately. When German troops invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, they uncovered the bodies, their uniforms still bearing insignias. The Wehrmacht seized upon the discovery for propaganda, inviting foreign observers to inspect the graves in 1943. International medical teams concluded the executions had occurred in 1940, during Soviet occupation, but Moscow insisted that the killings had been carried out by the Nazis in 1941. The Soviet press denounced the evidence as fabrications. Pravda carried headlines declaring German guilt, while documents were carefully planted to support the deception. Even during the Nuremberg trials, when prosecutors considered presenting Katyn as evidence of German war crimes, the matter dissolved into silence. No mention of Soviet guilt was permitted. The Western Allies, eager to maintain fragile cooperation with Stalin, accepted the version that suited wartime necessity. For decades, the truth remained entombed not only in the soil of Katyn, but also in the filing cabinets of the Kremlin. Families of the missing officers clung to hope, writing letters to Moscow, pleading for news of their fathers, brothers, and sons. Each response was a cold denial. The prisoner is no longer in custody. Survivors who spoke of Soviet guilt found themselves silenced. Polish émigrés who dared to accuse the USSR were discredited as Nazi collaborators. In London, members of the Polish government in exile who demanded inquiries were met with political isolation. Silence was the currency of diplomacy. The forest itself became haunted ground. Locals knew the earth concealed something unnatural, but speaking of it could mean arrest. Farmers ploughing fields near Smolensk uncovered bone fragments, scraps of uniforms, and personal effects, pocket watches, fountain pens, photographs. These items vanished into NKVD archives, catalogued and hidden under layers of red tape. A Gestapo file recovered in Berlin after the war, marked D24 Katyn, contained German photographs of the graves, stamped and numbered as evidence for propaganda use. Western intelligence agencies, including the OSS and later the CIA, collected fragments of testimony but filed them under restricted access, citing sensitivity of source. Intelligence assessments circulated privately acknowledged Soviet responsibility, but politically they remained silent. It was not until 1990, in the twilight years of the Soviet Union, that the first admissions appeared. Mikhail Gorbachev, under pressure from Poland's Solidarity movement and international scrutiny, released documents confirming Soviet guilt. Among them was Beria's original memorandum, still bearing Stalin's signature. Further files released in 1992 under Boris Yeltsin included meticulous execution lists, correspondence between NKVD officials, and logistical reports describing ammunition use, transport schedules, and burial operations. The language was bureaucratic, devoid of humanity. Phrases like completed transfer of prisoners replaced words like execution. The documents also revealed the systematic nature of the operation. Quotas assigned to individual NKVD officers, reports on the efficiency of disposal, and follow-up memos confirming completion of orders. The magnitude of the massacre lay not only in the numbers, but in its intent. By eliminating the Polish officer class, Moscow sought to cripple Poland's ability to resist Soviet control after the war. The graves of Katyn were not only mass burials, they were the silencing of a nation's leadership. The consequence echoed through Polish history for decades, leaving a scar in collective memory and fueling distrust of Soviet power long into the Cold War. For many families, the acknowledgement came too late. Widows had died without answers. Children had grown into adulthood, never knowing the fate of their fathers. The documents, once sealed under secret do not release, spoke with brutal clarity, but they could not return what was lost. The Katyn files demonstrate the terrifying efficiency of bureaucratic murder, the kind that requires not raging mobs, but men with clipboards and rubber stamps. The operation bore all the hallmarks of calculated state violence, secrecy, deception, and the manipulation of truth for political survival. To read these files today is to hear the echo of gunshots in the forest, muffled by snow and earth, concealed beneath decades of denial. The forest of Katyn remains a place where silence weighs heavier than sound, where the trees themselves seem to lean inward, as though listening to the whispers of the dead beneath their roots. And though the files were finally declassified, their shadows linger, reminding us that history can be rewritten, delayed, or denied, but never erased forever. Chapter 2. Operation Paperclip's darkest cargo in the final months of 1945. While the world celebrated the end of global conflict and the beginning of reconstruction, a new war was already taking shape, a war of intelligence, technology, and ideology. It was in this shadowed transition that Operation Paperclip emerged, a classified US project aimed at securing Nazi scientific expertise before it could be seized by the Soviet Union. While the operation has often been framed in public discourse as a race for rocket scientists, particularly men like Wernher von Braun and his V2 team, the files reveal a far darker dimension. Hidden beneath the veneer of technological progress lay records of human experimentation, chemical warfare, and biological studies, shielded from justice and carried across the Atlantic under diplomatic cover. The US government, determined to gain an edge in the Cold War, was willing to accept scientists whose hands were stained with atrocities, provided their knowledge could serve military and intelligence objectives. The earliest directives appear in Captured Office of Strategic Services memoranda, stamped eyes only and dated August 1945. In them, a handful of senior officials, later absorbed into the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency, outlined a program for the recruitment and relocation of German scientists, engineers, and physicians. While some were already known to be involved in conventional weaponry, others came from the darkest corners of the Third Reich's machinery. Laboratories connected to Dachau and Sachsenhausen had produced data on hypothermia, high-altitude endurance, and chemical exposure through human trials on prisoners. At Mittelwerk, beneath the Harz Mountains, Slave laborers perished in thousands while assembling V-2 rockets under SS Guard. Yet in the calculations of Washington's strategists, this knowledge was deemed too valuable to discard, even if it had been purchased with human suffering. Among the most disturbing files are references to Project 63, a sub-program within Paperclip focused on biomedical expertise. Declassified fragments detail the transfer of Dr. Hubertus Strughold, later called the father of space medicine, whose research foundations lay in experiments conducted on concentration camp prisoners subjected to extreme conditions. Others included chemists who'd worked on nerve agents like tabun and sarin, substances later stockpiled in American arsenals. According to a heavily redacted 1947 State Department cable, entire dossiers documenting individual scientists' war crimes were rewritten, sanitized, or destroyed to secure their entry visas. Official records would list them as engineers or research consultants, with no mention of their SS affiliations or experimental work on human subjects. The logistics of the operation were carried out with extraordinary secrecy. Special flights under military escort transported not only personnel, but crates of documents, technical schematics, and even preserved biological samples. A shipment noted in an Army Air Forces manifest from November 1945 was described only as restricted research materials, but annotations in the margin indicate that it contained cultures of typhus and plague bacteria from German laboratories. At Wright Field in Ohio and Fort Detrick in Maryland, these materials were catalogued and studied under classified programs, some of which remained undisclosed until the late 1970s. What the public saw was the story of former German engineers designing rockets that would one day send astronauts into orbit. What they did not see were the classified reports on chemical dispersal techniques, hypothermia tolerance, and organ failure thresholds derived from unwilling test subjects. Moral objections did surface within the American government. A small circle within the State Department argued that such recruitment contradicted the principles of the Nuremberg trials, where Nazi leaders were being prosecuted for crimes against humanity. Internal memos reveal sharp debates, with legal advisors insisting that participation in human experimentation constituted grounds for disqualification. But their voices were systematically overridden by military and intelligence officials who stressed the urgency of the Soviet threat. The Cold War calculus was clear. If the United States did not seize this knowledge, Moscow would. Justice could wait. Strategic superiority could not. In 1947, as the Cold War hardened, the program expanded. Former SS members were quietly integrated into US defense projects under false identities. Some were relocated to military bases in Texas and Alabama, while others were dispersed into civilian research facilities under government contracts. Cover stories were constructed, and when questions arose from journalists or members of Congress, responses were deflected with carefully worded denials. Files later uncovered show how the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, or JIO, deliberately altered personal histories, replacing references to war crimes with innocuous terms like political associations. The truth was rewritten in the language of bureaucracy. For the families of concentration camp victims, this secret bargain was a betrayal. At the very moment when survivors testified in Nuremberg about the horrors of medical experiments, the freezing chambers, the decompression trials, the injections of lethal pathogens, some of the very men responsible were boarding US military planes to new lives of security and privilege. Justice, so loudly proclaimed in the courtroom, was quietly suspended in the archives. Decades later, investigative journalists and congressional inquiries would uncover fragments of the deception, but by then the scientists had built careers, reputations, and legacies that blurred their origins. Some even received awards for their contributions to American science and medicine, their wartime pasts erased by classified files still locked away. The legacy of Paperclip's darkest cargo is one of moral compromise hidden beneath national triumph. The rockets that launched satellites and astronauts also carried with them the weight of slave labor and exploitation. The breakthroughs in aerospace medicine were grounded in suffering inflicted on helpless prisoners, and the chemical agents studied in secret bunkers echoed the formulas once tested on concentration camp victims. To read the declassified files is to witness a government's decision to rewrite history for strategic advantage, to place scientific progress above the pursuit of justice. Operation Paperclip did not merely transfer technology, it transferred guilt, sealing it within classified cabinets labeled top secret. where it remained buried for decades. In the silence of those archives, one can still hear the echo of questions never asked in courtrooms, and the sound of doors closing on the truth, so that rockets could rise into the sky, while the victims of their creators lay unremembered in the shadows of Europe's camps. Chapter 3. Tokyo's Forgotten Unit 731 experiments in the barren expanses of occupied Manchuria, concealed behind the innocuous title, Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army, that operated a facility whose very existence was denied for decades. Unit 731, commanded by General Shiro Ishii, was not a center of water sanitation, but rather the most extensive biological and chemical warfare program of the Second World War. It was here, near the city of Harbin, that thousands of prisoners, Chinese civilians, Korean laborers, Russian captives, and Allied soldiers unlucky enough to be caught in the wrong place, were subjected to experiments that remain among the darkest atrocities of the modern age. The archives that survive, fragmented and redacted, speak of vivisections conducted without anesthesia, of deliberate infection with plague and anthrax, of frostbite trials carried out in sub-zero temperatures until limbs shattered like glass. For years, Tokyo denied the program's existence, even as whispers from Soviet interrogations and scattered testimonies from surviving witnesses painted an unrelenting picture of horror. Construction of the complex began in 1936, under the direct oversight of the Imperial Japanese Army. The site covered more than 6 square kilometers, surrounded by barbed wire, guard towers, and layers of secrecy. At its center stood laboratories, incinerators, and underground chambers. Official documents referred to the prisoners as logs, reducing human beings to objects of data collection. Captured testimonies reveal that Ishii himself insisted on this dehumanizing terminology, a linguistic tool designed to mask the reality of systematic murder. Among the most chilling reports are those documenting the testing of plague bombs. Aircraft dropped ceramic containers filled with infected fleas over rural villages in Zhejiang and Hunan provinces. Soviet archives later recorded outbreaks that killed thousands, their origins disguised as natural disease cycles. American intelligence, intercepting Japanese communications, noted unusual patterns of cholera and typhus spreading through areas coinciding with Japanese military campaigns. The experiments extended beyond battlefield applications. In frostbite trials, prisoners were forced to expose limbs to the Manchurian winter until skin blackened and cracked. Limbs were then doused with hot water or beaten with sticks to study the speed of tissue damage. Surgeons recorded the results with clinical detachment, noting the exact minute when flesh ceased to respond. Other chambers were used for pressure testing. Subjects placed in decompression chambers until their eyes ruptured from sudden altitude shifts. Water immersion studies submerged prisoners in ice baths, timing the onset of hypothermia with stopwatches. Each experiment produced data points that would later be compiled into reports stamped confidential, Imperial Army use only. The final months of the war saw the program's most desperate activities. As the Red Army advanced into Manchuria in 1945, Ishii ordered the destruction of the compound. Prisoners were executed, buildings set ablaze, and records hastily burned. Yet fragments survived. Soviet troops captured abandoned laboratories, recovering evidence of animal experiments and contaminated equipment. Testimony from captured Japanese medical officers, presented during the 1949 Khabarovsk trials, detailed deliberate infections, dissections, and field tests of biological weapons. Though Western powers dismissed the Soviet trials as propaganda, the consistency of testimony, combined with material evidence, painted a disturbing picture. It was not propaganda, but suppressed truth. The most damning element lies in what followed. American intelligence agents, arriving in Japan after the surrender, recognized the value of the data produced at Unit 731. In correspondence declassified decades later, General Douglas MacArthur assured Japanese officials that immunity from prosecution would be granted in exchange for full cooperation. Files once marked top secret confirmed that Ishii and his senior staff provided detailed reports on plague, cholera, and frostbite research to US authorities. These reports were classified and stored at Camp Dietrich in Maryland, where they informed early Cold War biological warfare programs. Unlike Nazi doctors prosecuted at Nuremberg, the leaders of Unit 731 lived quietly, many resuming medical careers in post-war Japan. Ishii himself died peacefully in 1959, never facing trial for the deaths of thousands. For the victims, there was no justice. Families in Manchuria and occupied China mourned loved ones who disappeared into the compound, never to return. Villages devastated by outbreaks received no acknowledgement, their suffering erased by diplomatic necessity. Survivors who spoke of the atrocities were dismissed or silenced, their accounts buried beneath Cold War priorities. It was not until the 1980s and 1990s, through testimony of Japanese veterans and the persistence of Chinese investigators, that the scale of Unit 731 became undeniable. Declassified US files revealed the secret bargain, confirming that justice had been traded for data and that crimes against humanity had been excused in the name of scientific progress. The archives that survive are chilling not only for their content, but for their tone. Reports are written in the detached language of science, describing infection rates, mortality curves, and tissue responses, never acknowledging the humanity of the subjects. Marginal notes by Ishii and his staff critique methodology, recommend improvements, and request additional test groups, as though designing routine experiments rather than state-sanctioned murder. The bureaucratic efficiency of death is laid bare, showing how easily atrocity can be masked by technical jargon. To read these files is to confront the reality of a system where human suffering was measured not in cries or blood, but in data tables and footnotes. Today, the ruins of the Harbin facility stand as silent witness, though much has been erased. The ground still yields fragments, bone shards, surgical tools, broken vials. For decades, survivors' pleas for recognition were ignored by both Tokyo and Washington. Only slowly has the world begun to acknowledge the enormity of what occurred. But in the silence of declassified archives, one truth remains clear. The crimes of Unit 731 were not hidden because they were unknown. They were hidden because they were useful, and that utility ensured their secrecy, condemning their victims to decades of erasure, their voices drowned out by the hum of laboratories and the cold language of military necessity. Chapter 4. The Dresden Firestorm Cover-Up. On the night of February 13, 1945, the air above Saxony carried the low drone of hundreds of bombers, their silhouettes invisible against the winter sky. Below them, the city of Dresden, known not as an industrial hub, but as a cultural jewel of Europe, was swollen with civilians. Refugees fleeing the Soviet advance had flooded into the Baroque streets, seeking sanctuary from the chaos consuming the Reich. They carried bundles, children, and desperate hope. Few could have imagined that within hours, their city would become the site of one of the most devastating air raids in modern history. Yet within British and American archives, labelled under the name Operation Thunderclap, Annex D, the outlines of a darker motive emerge. Dresden was chosen not for military necessity, but as a demonstration of terror, designed to break Germany's will in the war's final months. The first wave came at 22:13, when Royal Air Force bombers swept across the city, dropping high-explosive ordnance to shatter rooftops and windows. Moments later, waves of incendiaries followed, cascading down onto wooden timbers, furniture, and cloth. Eyewitnesses described sparks igniting across entire neighborhoods in seconds, as if a match had been struck against the city itself. Hours later, American bombers arrived to repeat the pattern, sealing the inferno. Temperatures inside the firestorm rose above 1,500 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt metal, to fuse cobblestones, and to consume oxygen from cellars where families huddled. Streets became rivers of flame. Those who attempted to flee were caught in tornado-like winds, pulled into the heart of the blaze, where their bodies were reduced to ash. Refugee columns outside the city, caught in daylight raids the following morning, were strafed and bombed until nothing remained but smouldering carts and the fragments of belongings. Official communiques after the raid minimized the event, citing Dresden as a rail and communications hub, its destruction framed as a strategic blow. But buried in restricted archives were reports that told a different story. Intelligence assessments, including ultra-decrypts of German communications, indicated that Dresden's military value was limited. Factories were sparse, armament production negligible compared to other targets. Yet documents marked most secret reveal that the real objective was psychological. One memorandum from the Air Staff Planning Branch, dated January 1945, explicitly states the intent to make a profound impression on German morale. Annex D to Operation Thunderclap detailed secondary objectives: to create conditions that would overwhelm civil defense cripple refugee movements, and send a message to both the German populace and the advancing Soviet allies. It was not the elimination of tanks or aircraft assembly lines. It was the deliberate infliction of shock and terror. The casualty figures remain one of the most contested aspects of the Dresden bombing. Official Allied estimates settled on tens of thousands, a number designed to soften accusations of excessive force. But internal reports from the International Red Cross, suppressed for years, suggested figures potentially surpassing 100,000, given the city's swollen refugee population. Eyewitness testimony collected in Gestapo file DD-17 described streets littered with corpses burned beyond recognition, entire families fused together by heat, and cellars where hundreds suffocated from lack of air. Recovery teams described scenes of unimaginable horror. Human shadows seared into stone walls, bodies shrunk to childlike proportions from incineration, entire neighborhoods erased from the map. Yet the political calculus demanded minimization. Winston Churchill himself, in a private memorandum dated March 1945, expressed unease at the scale of destruction, writing that the attack seemed mere terror bombing. That memorandum, later softened and rewritten, reveals the internal struggle between military pragmatism and the moral weight of the act. For decades, the narrative of Dresden was carefully managed. In West Germany, the bombings were used as political leverage during the Cold War, while in Britain and America, they were downplayed as tragic but necessary acts of war. Archives containing operational details remain sealed under national interest. Scholars who sought access in the 1960s and 1970s found redacted documents, missing appendices, and heavily edited summaries. It was only in the 1990s, when files were partially declassified, that the extent of Annex D's planning became known. The language within is chilling in its detachment, describing saturation, bombing efficiency, optimal firestorm, generation, and civilian disruption. Nowhere do the files mention the human, beings consumed by the flames. The legacy of Dresden is not only in its ruins but in its erasure. Survivors carried the memory in silence, their testimonies often dismissed as exaggerations or propaganda. Yet the ruins themselves spoke louder than words. Twisted steel, melted stone, and the skeletal remains of the Frauenkirche standing against a sea of ash. Photographs smuggled out by neutral diplomats captured the devastation, but these too were hidden in archives for decades. The Cold War demanded unity among allies, and revisiting Dresden's truth threatened to fracture that unity. Thus, silence prevailed. To read the declassified files today is to confront the dissonance between public history and classified reality. Dresden was not merely collateral damage of total war, it was a calculated demonstration, a weaponization of fire designed to annihilate not armies, but the spirit of a people. In the clinical language of Annex D, one finds the blueprint for terror disguised as strategy, a reminder that even in victory, governments will conceal truths that challenge the narratives they need to survive. The firestorm ended in 1945, but its smoke lingers still, in the archives stamped "secret," in the charred stones of a rebuilt city, and in the silence of those who were never meant to speak of what they had seen. In every archive, there are still locked drawers. In every official history, there are missing pages. The files on Katyn, Paperclip, Unit 731, and Dresden remind us that war is not only fought with bullets and bombs, but with silence, omission, and deliberate erasure. These were not accidents of record keeping. They were choices. Choices to conceal massacres in a Russian forest, to import war criminals under the guise of science, to trade justice for biological warfare data, and to disguise the annihilation of a city as a military necessity. Each file reveals a pattern. When truth threatened power, truth was buried. What makes these revelations most chilling is not only what was done, but how long it was hidden, how carefully governments maintained the silence, and how willingly the world accepted convenient lies. The shadows of these files reach far beyond the Second World War. They echo in the Cold War's secret laboratories, in diplomatic compromises, and in the ongoing battles over memory and denial. To confront them is to accept that history is never complete, that what we know has always been filtered, redacted, and selectively revealed, and so we are left with questions that archives alone cannot answer. How many more files remain sealed in vaults marked classified? What truths still lie buried under the weight of national security? And when those files surface, will we be prepared to face them? not as myths, but as the forbidden history we were never meant to know.